Greetings, this is Artie from Artifact Electronics. In this episode, I'm going to take you on a tour of one of the first video game consoles that was cartridge based. It's the Atari, which was originally called the Video Computer System. Came out in September of 1977 and was sold on and off in different versions until the end of 1991, during which time they sold 28 million consoles and hundreds of millions of cartridges. Now, this has spawned many, not lookalikes only, but workalikes. And let's have a look and see what we got here. Here's just a handful of them. There are more of them, but these are the ones that I have in my possession. It's the Granddaddy. The latest version, which was called, at which point they changed the name from Video Computer System, or VCS, to the 2600, because they didn't want to cause confusion about this system and their home computers. There is one that was made by Coleco called the Gemini, and more recently the Atari Flashback came out, which has a bunch of built-in games. And yes, there were others. But I think these will give you a pretty good idea of what these were all about. So let's briefly go through each one of these and then have a look inside. So let's start out with the original, which was designed to fit into everybody's home decor at the time, with the fake wood and the I guess that's this is the way things had to look in the late 70s and on, for people to be comfortable with them in their living rooms. Anyway, this is the second release of the original. The first release, this is called the 4-button or 4-switch. The original had 6 switches. You can see there's ample space over here for an extra switch. And those switches were moved to the back of the console over here, which was the game difficulty. This one, left game difficulty and right game difficulty, as referred to the left and right controller. And this selected the channel, the TV channel. The reason for that was, at the time, there were very few televisions, if any, that had a composite video input, because there was no need for it. So what comes out of here is a video signal that is transmitted, is modulated for either channel 2 or 3. It's not just video, the audio is also in there. And you just plugged it into the external antenna input on your television set, and off you went. Now the cartridges for this looked like this. These were the original Atari cartridges. A lot of third-party manufacturers came out and did these, but this is what the originals looked like. They were Loctite. You couldn't see the edge connector in there. I mean, all it is a PC board with a mask ROM on it. And if any of you watched my last video on the Atari XG game system, or the Atari XE game system, at that point I stated that the main use of a cover for a cartridge was to keep the contacts clean so they wouldn't corrode or go bad when laying in a toy box or whatever. That is still true. Same thing here, because you can see it's pretty well sealed when the cartridge is pulled out. But after some more research, I found out that another main reason for this cover is to prevent static electricity from damaging the mask ROM in here. Well, static electricity, i.e. no little fingers should get in here. And the way it works is when you put it in, you see these two protrusions here. They push into here, at which point you push it down and you can see the actual edge connector in there. But of course, as long as it's sitting in the motherboard, it is somewhat sealed. And then when you pull it out, the thing is supposed to pop back up like this, so as not to collect dirt or static electricity from human or animal fingers. Other games, of course, this costs money, so other games went the cheap route and just left it open with the edge connector sticking out. And it did make a difference, because when you get these games, the first thing you got to do is clean the edge fingers here with alcohol, or even something stronger, that if the alcohol doesn't work, you got to take some acetone to clean these. But be careful with the acetone, because it'll eat the plastic if you let it drip. So what you do is you take a Q-tip and you put a small amount of acetone on it, small in the sense of it not dripping when you're holding it in your hand, and then carefully wipe the contacts with it. Wipe off the contacts with it, and as long as the Q-tip comes back black, you know it's dirty. So keep rinse and repeat until the Q-tip comes back clean, and in most cases that'll fix the fix cartridges. There are many cartridges that just won't work, and in a lot of times it's a problem with dirt and contamination on the edge fingers here. So what does she look like on the inside? Or better, what makes her tick? So I removed 4 screws from the bottom, and now this thing should just lift off top portion. Oh no. And here you go. This is what the inside looks like. Well, everything's well hidden because it's got an RFI shield over the electronics, on both sides. But thankfully, this RFI shield is not soldered. So it's supposed to have 4 tabs around the perimeter that when you straighten those out, one in front, one in back, and there's supposed to be 2 more on each side, but they're broken off. They were broken off when I got it, actually, which means somebody else was in there. And then they got some conductive tape connecting the switch commons to the shield. It's not in all of the machines, but there were a lot of production changes. I've seen a lot of PCBs for these. Of course, the one with 6 switches, the PCB was wider to accommodate the extra switch on each side, but they messed around a lot with them. They also had a heavy aluminum heatsink on the original over here, which actually made the console noticeably heavier. But I guess they finally figured out that these tin shields would do the same job and be much cheaper. So let's see if the tabs would allow me to take this off now. Yes, it does. And the bottom part comes off. So now we can see the inside. So here's a PCB. I just noticed they have these dust shields here on the switches. This dust shield is missing, which, and I didn't lose it. So somebody else opened this for whatever reason at some time in the past and neglected to put this back, but I don't think it makes a big difference. I mean, these are, just as the name implies, dust shields, so dust doesn't get into the world's cheapest slide switches. And these get dirty and corrode real badly. And they knew it. That's why they went to the extra expense of putting these guys on there. But yes, here it is. The major components are, we have the RF modulator, which as an input takes, there is a composite signal coming out of here. So it's actually not too hard to convert this to have a composite video and sound output, separate outputs. If you want to do that to yours, I'm not going to repeat it here because there are many, many, many different videos on YouTube telling you how to do that. But the principle is simple. Tap off the composite video and the sound. Give it a little bit of amplification with a transistor because otherwise it's too weak. And make sure that the impedance is 75 ohms on the output. And it'll go into any composite input then. But let's keep it original, right? So anyway, this is the modulator. It uses a 5-volt regulator over here. It gets 10 volts DC in and just uses a standard 7805 regulator. This lets you adjust the color phase, or it's basically the color control. And other than that, all that's in here are 3 ICs and a color burst crystal. Color burst is a 3.58 crystal that is used to generate dot clocks on a CRT TV. Well, actually, also for the composite. Now, you would think that these 3 are custom chips made by Atari, but upon further research, it turns out that only one of these is custom, and that's this one. And these 2 are off-the-shelf chips. So what are these? This is the CPU over here, which is a 6507. The 6507 was a low-cost version of the 6502 with less address lines, and the 6502 had 40 pins, and this has, what is it, 28 pins or 24? No, 28 pins. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So it's a 28-pin chip. They dropped 2 of the address lines so that instead of being able to address 64K, no, actually they dropped 3 address bits. So you can only address 8 bits, 8K of memory with this chip. A significant portion of it is that a lot of control signals were also deleted from this. And you can live without most of them, but the most interesting part is that the interrupt requests, both the NMI, the non-maskable interrupt, and the regular interrupt pins were deleted. I mean, they're internally just tied to the inactive state. But a little later you'll find out why that is significant. In a bad way. Next we have a MOS technology, which, the 6502 was created by MOS technology. And this is a MOS technology 6532, nicknamed the Riot chip. And Riot stands for RAM, Input, Output, and Timer. Those are the elements contained on this chip, but it is mostly used to read the joystick controller inputs, and helps out a little bit with the timer. And of course the RAM, system RAM of 128 bytes is also on here. So these two chips at that time were available off the shelf. Of course Atari probably got a really good price, since they were both from originally from Moss. This one has a Rockwell logo on it, and is that a Rock? Yeah, that's a. I think that is. And same with this chip, with the Riot chip, but they are house numbered. Well, this one has a house number, and then it says 6507. And this one also has an Atari house number, and then it says 6532. So no big surprise there. The only thing that was left over was this chip, which was called the Stella chip. And I tried to figure out why they called it Stella. I mean, did they call everything with women's names, or name them with women's names or whatever? Then how come they didn't name these the same, but these were commercial? Anyway, it turns out that the person who designed this chip rode a bicycle to work every day, and his bicycle's name was Stella. How you get from a bicycle name to naming the chip, I don't know, but that's why this thing was called Stella. The more unofficial name, actually Stella was the unofficial name. The official name of this was the TIA, the Television Interface Adapter, that took all of the digital data and converted it so that it could be properly shown on a television screen. It also did sound. It did a whole bunch of stuff, but that was the only custom chip on here. I won't get too deeply into the technicalities of this. Maybe I'll do it in another episode, but the interesting thing is that pretty much when you're on a computer and you want to display something on the screen, you write to an area of memory called the frame buffer, or the display memory. And you do that mostly asynchronously. So you build your screen on an internal block of memory, and then the video circuitry comes along when the time is right and picks out, reads that memory, and displays that data on the screen. Now that makes programming a display relatively easy compared to what this actually requires. Frame buffer is memory, and memory costs money. And I forgot to mention that the screen resolution that this offers is 160 horizontal by 192 vertical. So you would need, for a system that has 128 bytes of RAM, you would need a lot more than that. What is that? That's 80 times 192, which is approximately what? 16K. So you'd have to have an extra 16K chip in here, which costs a lot of money in the late 70s to have a full frame buffer. So they're playing a little trick here where essentially you have a horizontal line buffer in here that is 3 bytes long. And the way it works, it scans the bits in those 3 bytes, and the pixels on this each are 4 clocks wide. So to get 160 pixels across, well, you can't, the resolution doesn't actually support 160 pixels, because each one is 4 pixels wide, or 4 dot clocks wide. Each pixel is actually 4 dot clocks wide, and if you do all the math for it, from what I've explained so far, you can get 20 pixels per line. But what they did is, when it draws half the horizontal line, then it goes back to the beginning of the the horizontal line buffer and repeats what it did for the first 20 pixels, but it has a register where you can invert to have that buffer read back in reverse when it's on the right half of the screen, so as to create a mirror image of it. And yeah, I said I'm not going to get into it deeply, but I just wanted to let you know that essentially there's no frame buffer. You have to update all of the screen pixels in mostly real time. So essentially, you create that frame buffer, and when it's done displaying the horizontal line and doing a horizontal retrace, you have to rewrite those bytes to create the next line. It wasn't an easy thing to do, and you had to be really good at cycle counting, and that's where the part comes in. Remember I said there are no interrupt inputs on this processor? I think an interrupt would have been really, really useful to take all that timing off your hands, but it doesn't exist. So basically the way you write code for these is you have to cycle count. You're writing assembly language, and the way you do your timing is you count how long each instruction takes, and that's how you decide. So while it's displaying the line in here, you can do some other work, figuring out game logic or whatever. And then the minute it does a horizontal retrace, in the horizontal retrace, you have to rewrite the line buffer in here. And that's enough of that. If you can read up on this online if you want to know the gory details, but it doesn't have a frame buffer, and it has a very small line buffer in here. And you can't just go ahead and write code. You have to count cycles, and you have to make sure that everything happens. You have to have a clear picture of yourself, imagining the electron beam on a CRT when you're writing code for this. Now, for the majority of code, there's vertical. Remember, on a horizontal retrace, you probably rebuild the line buffers. Then we also have the vertical retrace, which is a lot longer, and that's where you do your game logic in. Again, you have to cycle count it exactly, because there's no signal that tells you, hey, start vertical blank or end vertical blank. You have to be aware of where all of that is. So now you know how to program an Atari VCS /2600, but that's the main principles of this. Cartridges were limited to 4K because of the lesser number of address lines on this. But there were some bank switching schemes used, and I think in the very end, some of the last games actually had 32K of ROM in them. And the way it worked was they just bank switched them in and out to gain access to, to a larger code space. Here's a 2600, nicknamed the Junior. Had a smaller case, came out. This was the last model they did for it. Some more cost reduction on it. The inside, I mean, the PCB looks different, but it's the exact same electronics, the same 3 chips we just talked about here, and they're interchangeable. And so all they really did was basically this was thrown at an industrial engineer, and he was told to make it cheaper. Speaking of cheaper, the original 2600 with this board is rumored, I mean, this is coming off the internet. I have no other way of verifying or not verifying this, but it cost $40 to manufacture, and the out-the-door price was like $199, which in sales terms was the ideal ratio of 5-to-1, i.e. the ratio of your retail price as compared to your cost of goods. But that didn't last too long because there was competition from other manufacturers, and this got price reduced this had an ongoing price reduction. It dipped below $100, and in the end, the Junior was sold for $49.95. So I hope they got the cost of this down, way down below $40, because otherwise it wouldn't have made a whole lot of business sense. Next we have the Coleco Gemini, and this thing is a clone. It has a much more industrial design, doesn't fit into your typical 70s apartment. Looks much more Spartan, but I'm sure that saved them some money because they were competing against the 2600. And I don't know price-wise how much they were, but these were cheaper than the original Atari. Now the point is how did they get away with this? Now remember, there were 3 ICs in there. This has the same 3 ICs. Well, it has 2 ICs that are apparently the same, the CPU and the Riot chip. And then there's a third chip, which is a TIA chip, which I would assume was Atari's intellectual property. Now circuit designs can't be patented. What can be patented or is considered intellectual property is of course code that you write and custom chips. The TIA is a custom chip. Now what I did, just for grins, was I pulled the chips from this and I put them into the 2600, and guess what? They worked. Which wasn't a big surprise on the 2 off-the-shelf chips, but the TIA, the television interface adapter chip, worked alike and had the same pinout. So I'm guessing that Coleco made some sort of a deal with Atari and licensed that chip, because this was, I mean, if Atari had taken them to court, they would have lost right off the bat. So I guess Atari figured, hey, you know, at least we'll get some money out of them. Because I guess if they refused to license the chip, then it would have become, you know, under monopoly laws, and I don't know. I don't have the legal mind or the knowledge for that. But my guess is that this thing, the video chip in here, was licensed from Nintendo. Freudian slip. From Atari. And also, remember, Coleco made the ColecoVision game console, which was more powerful than anybody else's. And they made expansion packs for it that you could plug into the cartridge port or into a front expansion port, and that expanded the game console. And one of the expansion accessories that Coleco offered was a 2600 cartridge adapter. So what that means is you plug that into your ColecoVision, and then you put 2600 cards into it, and your ColecoVision played at 2600 cards. So yes, I'm definitely sure that there was some licensing involved in all of that. One other machine that I don't have was Atari's last video game console, which was called they had the Atari 5200, and then they came out with the Atari 7800. And the 7800 also played, well, that was Atari's own, but it played 2600 games, which looked just like the 2600, and then 7800 games, which were more sophisticated because they had the processor ran faster, there was more memory space, more RAM, and all of that in there. But even the 7800 wasn't enough to save Atari. Other clones, I can't think of right now, but everybody wanted in on the game. And of course, what this created the Atari created the industry of disgruntled programmers that worked for Atari and wrote games. Never got the recognition. They didn't get their names on their cartridges. They were just treated like normal employees in the beginning not even given bonuses for the work they did. So a lot of them split off and started their own game development companies that created cartridges for the 2600. I think the very first one and the most famous one was Activision, that was started by 3 or 4 of Atari programmers, which all created hit games for Atari, and said, hey, if Atari doesn't give us the recognition and money we deserve, we'll just start our own. Of course, that caused a lot of legal problems again, because they were using proprietary information that they had gained while working at Atari, and that was also settled out of court with Activision agreeing to pay Atari a license fee for each cartridge they made. So yeah, a lot of people, a cottage industry, well, it wasn't exactly a cottage industry, because you couldn't just do this in your garage. You needed some, for the time, heavy-duty machinery for cross-assembling and testing and all of that. But there were several companies out there, most of which disappeared after the video game crash of 1983. But the bottom line of it all was, all of these people, in one way or the other, filled Atari's coffers. Even though they were competing against Atari, Atari still got their licensing fees out of them. And in the end, well, while it lasted, Atari did really well. But of course, a few years later, they sold Atari to Jack Tramiel, and Atari, for all intents and purposes, the Atari home division, for all intents and purposes, was gone. So then we come to this guy, the Atari Flashback, a miniature version of the original 2600. This was made by Atari Interactive. I'm not exactly sure if at that time the company, well, this was done in the late 90s, in the late 2000s. And I'm not exactly sure who owned this and who made it and who licensed it, but it was released under the Atari name with the Atari logo on it. And what this was a modern version of it, everything on a single chip. There's a blob in there with a substrate underneath that basically does everything. Has the processor, the graphics. It has composite outputs, video composite and sound outputs. And you get a menu and you get to select from 40 games, more if you enter a cheat code. But I don't find no place to put the cartridge in. And this brings us to a very interesting characteristic of this. I think we're currently in Atari Flashback number 9 or 10, or they keep coming out with new ones of these, and the only difference really is the cases look slightly different. They're gold versions and silver versions and platinum versions, and the next version has 4 games on it that the previous version didn't have, and it's kind of useless. It gives you a way to play the games with a composite output, but it's not very exciting. But they did one very exciting thing with this, and only with the Flashback 2. So here are the guts of it, top of the board. There's an interesting table over here. And if we have a look at that table, if I can get it to focus at all, there you go. It basically gives a number and then a signal name. 1 is A7, for instance. 24 is ground. So what these represent is the connections on a cartridge. The numbers of these pins. So theoretically, if we turn this around And we find each of those tie points on the back, and we connected that to a cartridge. Then we could play cartridges. Now mechanically, of course, that's kind of difficult here. But that's what it means. They actually gave you the capability of creating a cartridge, a physical cartridge port for this. And of course, I couldn't say no to that. And here's a sampling of them. They're not through holes, they're just pads. 10, 11, what is it, 8. They're all here. If you look, you'll find them numbered from 1 through 24. And those are the connection points for a cartridge connector. Okay, so that's really nice and good. And what do we do with that? So what do? We need, electrically we know what to do. We have 24 pads in there that we got to connect to an edge connector, and find a place for it so we can stick cartridges into this. Step 1, we need to find an edge connector and the associated machinery, not machinery, but mechanical stuff. Remember, it had the 2 protrusions to allow opening of the cartridge shutter. So it's not enough to just have a connector, 24-pin edge connector, but anyway, so this is the recipe for it. You go through your junk pile and you find something that in your opinion is either unrepairable or not worth repairing. In my case, it was another Gemini cartridge, console, that had some unknown material spilled inside, which was extremely corrosive or had become corrosive over time and destroyed part of the main PCB. Fortunately, it destroyed the part around here. Here's a cartridge port. As you can see, there's nothing in it anymore because I removed the connector along with the shroud that goes over it. And then, through the magic of time-lapse cinematography, I created this. The hardest part actually was mounting this. Well, the hardest part was cutting a rectangular hole with straight edges in here, which I failed at spectacularly, but it's secure. It's screwed to the bottom of the case, and you can now plug cartridges into it. The only other thing it needs some switches on the back where you select whether it plays the interior collection of 40 games or whatever, or whether it enables and plays the cartridge. And yes, it does work, as I shall demonstrate a little later on. Alright, so how do we demonstrate this? Remember, this is outputting a modulated TV signal on channel 3. So the first thing we do, we take our output from the Atari and we use an input to something that can display a TV signal. But this don't fit. So after judicious use of some adapters, first we use a coax to RCA, goes in, which it does. And then of course we have two male RCAs, and we use a gender changer, and now we're plugged in. Cool. Oh, and we also have to plug in a cartridge. Then what I am using is an older LCD monitor that does have a TV input. And then we turn on the Atari. And there you go. And now we should be able to play this game. So we also need to plug in a joystick. Just a standard joystick like this plugs into the back of the Atari. And then we play. And so on and so forth. And we can now use it for its intended purpose and just plug in whatever games we feel like. And have fun playing. And miss everything. You missed everything. Picture is kind of noisy, which is inherent in using an RF connection, but it's very visible and very playable. So that's the original. Let's now have a look at our modified flashback. And here's our flashback. The switches on the back are set for normal operation, which means your internal games are accessible. And it'll give you, well, let's see what it does. We turn it on, and it gives you categories of games. Let's go to Arcade Favorites, hit the button, and you can scroll through the different games. These are all original cartridge images. Sure, Centipede. So that was a lot of fun. I guess when you reset, it doesn't go back. Doesn't do anything, so I guess you could power cycle it. And then we're back here again. Skill and action zone. Skill and action zone. But I have no skills. So space station. Space War? What's that? Oh, it's asteroids without asteroids. With the missiles bouncing around and you can't fly off the screen. Boom. Got him. And of course, one final one, adventure territory. Return to a secret quest wizard. Haunted house. All right, already. Okay. Anyway, you get the idea. It plays them pretty cleanly because it's the digital composite output on here. And this doesn't even have a TV output, of course. That's why I switched. But let's see. Let's turn it into a cartridge game. So what I'm going to try here is lock and chase. Move the switches to enable the cartridge, and there it is. This is actually my preferred way of playing 2600 games because you're getting a very clean output. You don't have to deal with the interference from an analog TV signal. So yet another Pac-Man clone. Why is it making slot machine noises? Jackpot. No. Anyway, so now we can play all of our cartridges in here. My favorite cartridge, of course, being, just like on the Atari XE game system. I loved it that Nintendo actually licensed games to Atari. But what else is there? Let's find one final game. I have a pretty good collection of original 2600 cards. So River Raid is always a pleasure to play. All you gotta do is shoot everything and make sure you don't run out of fuel or and don't run into anybody else. The interesting thing about this game is that all of the screens are algorithmically generated. So it's basically, as you're scrolling up, it has a bunch of, you seed the terrain generator with specific numbers, and it will always generate the same terrain for you, including the enemies. And obviously uses very little RAM, because all you need is an algorithm and a bunch of seeds. Boom. One of the more funner games. And I think I should show you the masterpiece. One of the games that sold, I think, close to 6 or over 6 million cartridges for the Atari VCS. And that game is, and here it is. How can anything go wrong if you have a licensed version of Pac-Man on your console? I shouldn't have shown you the cartridge. I should have just shown you the display and have you guess what game it was. Looked just like another shitty Pac-Man clone, but they did sell, I think, over 6 million of these. But I think the other 9 million they made went to a landfill in Arizona. So, needless to say, they didn't do too well. And the reason for that is this game, I guess they got the license and they wanted to make sure that this game gets released for the holidays. So this game, this game was created in 6 weeks, it is rumored. And with the not so stellar performance capabilities of this platform, I mean, a lot of people bought it because of the name, but a lot of those people were extremely disappointed with the game experience. See how the ghosts start to flicker, because you can only have so many sprites on the same horizontal line. So if I go over here, yeah, see how they go bananas? I mean, a lot of the charm in the original Pac-Man, aside from the way the game played, were the sounds. And see, they're always flickering, so you can't really tell whether they're ghosts or actual Pac-Man or... Needless to say, I can feel the pain of the 6 million people who bought this. And it's an interesting story about the landfill, because both this game and the Indiana Jones game they did were overproduced, and millions of those and other games they had left over in their warehouses ended up in a landfill, which was unearthed a few years ago because nobody believed it. But they actually got permission, or I don't know how they swung it, but they went down there and started digging out the games, which were unceremoniously dumped underground without, I mean, it wasn't like they were packed or anything in plastic bags. They were just dumped. And most of that stuff was, of course, the packaging was deteriorated. The labels on the cartridges were deteriorated, but people got some stuff out of there. Kind of useless if you ask me, but that just sped up the demise of Atari. But as you can see, there were a bunch of good games for this too. It's enjoyable, and Flashback 2, when converted to accept the cartridge, will allow you to play all of the games in their original glory. I'm not big on emulators for classic video consoles, because playing this on a computer, the display is too clean. It doesn't play right. It doesn't look right. It doesn't sound right. I think this is the best solution for getting as close as possible to the original experience without having to put up with an RF connection to a television. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. If you want to see me create more content, please like, subscribe, share, and leave me a comment. Tell me about your experiences with early video game consoles. See you later.